Ladies and gentlemen, hello and very welcome to the third installment of the Urban Futures Hub series. My name is Leila Niamir, Senior Research Scholar and lead of the Urban Futures Hub at International Institute for Applied System Analyzing, IIASA in Austria. And I'm delighted to officially open today's session. We are honored to have a distinguished speakers with us today who will share their insight on justice for resilient development in cities. This session will be managed and moderated by my very good colleague and dear colleague, Professor Minal Pathak. So without further ado, dear Minal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you confirm that you can hear me? Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting us, IIASA, and setting this up. And thanks to my co-panelists. So yeah, let's begin. So the issues of equity and justice are not new to cities, as many of us understand that historically cities have always been sites of power, of opportunity, and of exclusion also. If you look at the early settlements on the Indus Valley civilization, we also see that there was housing segregation back then, where the rich would live in these raised citadels, and then there would be common folk, and within the lower housing areas also you would have housing of different sizes. And so we could see from therein, and the situation is not very different now. Cities are still continue to remain unequal, and urbanists, theorists, and practitioners have long grappled with these issues. And as we navigate the challenges of climate change, of urbanization, very rapid in some parts of the world, and growing inequality, the idea of justice, whether we talk about distributive justice or procedural or spatial, it becomes central to imagining sustainable and inclusive cities. Future urban development alongside a changing climate will entail major transformations. And the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change in Cities, where I'm co-leading Chapter 5, we look at solutions by city type and regions. And we know because that challenges for different types of cities are different, and cities have different capacities for undertaking action. So for established cities in the global north, there are issues, for example, of affordable heating or energy poverty. For many cities in the global south, they're still grappling with addressing service deficits in informal settlements, and there is not enough resources. So in the chapter, we look at questions like, what is a solution? Where or in what type of city can it be implemented? How can it be implemented? And we look at enabling conditions. Who has access to finance, for example? We look at when in terms of temporality, in terms of sequencing of solutions. But the most central aspect of this solution space is the who. Who decides where the solution will be implemented? Who decides how will be implemented? And who is impacted by the implementation of these solutions? And we all know that equity arises at different stages of urban planning. So whether we talk about urban climate action plans, and I know Cynthia, Diana, and Leila, but also many in the audience have looked at urban climate plans in detail. And we know that these plans are shaped by who is in the room, and there is the element of agency on who gets to say what the plan will have, who gets to decide where housing will be, where transportation lines will happen. And in many cities of the global south, particularly in South Asia, where I come from, cities don't have capacity to plan. So these plans are often made by external agents, consultants, sometimes directed by funding agencies. And therefore, the priorities, of course, would vary on the basis of who gets to make these decisions. So at the planning stage, and these plans are often sort of overlaid on the city. And it's, of course, the most vulnerable that are not often considered in these climate plans. Moving from planning to implementation, we know during implementation, there are equity issues such as, the most commonly studied one is displacement. And a lot of these climate actions, we have studied co-benefits of, for example, air quality co-benefits, health co-benefits, but we don't understand trade-offs too well. And trade-offs are sort of mentioned, in numbers sometimes as displaced people, but we don't know who those displaced people are. We just have the numbers. And we also know that it's harder to quantify trade-offs compared to co-benefits because it's just very difficult to measure trade-offs. And also, particularly in data poor regions of the world, it's more challenging. Uh, and then moving from implementation to post-implementation, we know that poorly implemented urban climate action can have adverse consequences for some populations. And this element that Diana will come to in a bit, they talk about urban greening programs and how these would affect housing prices, access to green spaces. But we're still talking of the now, but what of the future? And we are now very soon looking at a world where 1.5 degrees will be exceeded. And in that world, what does climate action look like? And what are the new equity issues that will come about? Whether it is how carbon dioxide removal will be implemented. What does it mean for urban-rural continuum? What does it mean for employment and other impacts such as agriculture or food security? So there are many questions here, but we can't address all, but we will try to address some. And I hope Diana's presentation will address some of these issues. But before I pass to Diana, I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague and friend, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig, who is, of course, a very famous scientist. She needs no introduction. She's at the NASA Goddard Space Institute at Columbia University. She's the principal editor of the third assessment report on climate change and cities. And she is the director of the New York hub of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. She set up the whole Urban Climate Research Network together. Now it has hundreds of scientists and practitioners in the network. I'm going to pass it to Cynthia to talk about the Element series. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Minal, and thank you for that really wonderful introduction to our discussion today on justice and equity in regard to climate change in cities. And thank you to Leila for organizing and inviting us to be part of the Urban Futures webinar series at IIASA. Just want to say, I spent a year at IIASA back in the day. And so I'm always very happy to connect with IIASA. So I'm going to introduce the Urban Climate Change Research Network. We call it UCERN, the third assessment report on climate change in cities. It's called ARC 3.3. So UCERN's mission is to provide knowledge that enables cities and their metropolitan regions to lead on climate change mitigation and adaptation with a focus on action, equity, the topic of our webinar today, and sustainable development. As Minal said, we're over 2,000 scientists, scholars, expert practitioners, spanning the broad range of expertise needed to really confront climate change in cities. We then these researchers and our work represent over more than 150 low, middle, and high income cities around the world. We were formed in 2007, so we're not a new kid on the block at the time of the C40 summit in New York. These are the components of UCERN, the components, the action components. So let me start with the big green one right in the middle, regional hubs. So this is across, we're going to see the map in a moment, across 15 key cities in regions all around the world, across all the inhabited continents. We do the scientific assessments, and that includes making projections of what the climate change is, the downscaled projections for that decision makers do need for really developing those solutions. Let me do next the City Solutions case study docking station, and now we are creating an atlas of these, and that is developed in parallel with the IPCC SR Cities report. We have very strong education component through our MOOC at MIT with that Department of Urban Studies. And then we bring all of this knowledge to work with cities all over the world in the urban design climate workshops. Here are the 15 hubs and where they are, so you can see that they are led by hub directors. They facilitate the two-way transfer of climate knowledge, right? It's what is being learned from cities on the ground in these regions. So it's not just the cities, it's for the region. And then the linkage to the global network. They operate on a continental scale, and we have all the names on the bottom are they're just a vital part of the USERN network is the work of the hub directors. Thank you. Next one. Okay, let's turn to this massive undertaking that USERN undertakes with the assessment reports on climate change in cities. This is the third iteration, so it's benchmarked. So it fits very nicely with the IPCC special report, which is a one-time thing, which is great. So great that the countries have really agreed to focus on the cities in AR7. It's fantastic, but that you can see that then it's very complementary to the benchmark knowledge with the assessment with ARC3 series to see how knowledge evolves through time. So as we have published so far too, they're published by Cambridge University Press. They provide readers and users, I would say, with urban climate change knowledge and tools to heighten opportunities for resilience and sustainability. 2 have been published so far. The COVID-19 was the lead off, and the second one we're going to be delving deeply into with Diana's presentation shortly. As we said, planning, urban design, and architecture is coming in the next few days. We're very, very excited. There was just a launch event in Paris, but you can see the other topics. I won't read them all, but please glance over all the topics, because these are all the topics needed for the actors, for the city actors, including the equity, very much so the equity and environmental justice groups, which are in all cities around the world, to really have the knowledge that they need to bring together and create the appropriate and effective solutions for each city's context. Next, please. The next is about, just to give you a very brief glance at or look at one of the way that the COVID, the first one does, the way that we work with stakeholders and major findings and key messages. So we deliver actionable research, policy recommendations. So it's like, oh no, this is not just, oh well, here's all this information, but we actually focus it into key major finding and key messages. So for example, and this thanks so much to Minal, who organized the COVID-19 city stakeholder engagement with Darshini Mahadevia, who is the coordinating lead author for this element. So first of all, key facts, thinking back to the COVID, which has changed our world, basically. From 20 to 22, the COVID-19 pandemic was urban in nature, with 95% of total reported cases in cities. It's very interesting to really grapple with that these pandemics are looming for the cities as we go forward. We can't forget about what happened with the pandemic. And one of the key messages that came out of the great work of the COVID element was to that support for digitalization and associated technologies can improve pandemic responses. So they looked at what all the different cities did. And the ones that did use technology and digitalization really helped to respond to the pandemic and get ready for climate change management practices in the future. Just a word about all across ARC 3.3, the author demographics. 54% identify as female, 54% are from cities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. It is truly a global network. Next, please. And just to give one example of a case study, and this is we're linking to the SR cities through case studies. So we create expert reviewed case studies from around the world that they integrate local mitigation and or adaptation strategies into analysis. So here is a sneak peek in the planning, urban design, architecture element to one of the case studies, which was done by our wonderful colleague Juliana Velez-Duque and her colleague Sarah Artiaga Morales. Please visit the UCERN case study database. There's the QR code. This is just to give an example of here in Colombia. This is an analysis of the Apartado River Master Plan that addresses risk, governance, environmental degradation, and cultural representation as a key part of the focus today, to create a proposal that strengthens disaster responses. And here's the key message, just demonstrating the importance of centering adaptation actions and risk management around communities and local stakeholders, as Minal really put forward in her excellent opening remarks. Next, please. Oh, I think this is the last one and here's all the QR codes. So the left is, so in the middle is, let's see, on the right-hand side is all ARC 3.3 publications. The COVID one is on the left, and the middle one is the scanning the QR code to read the full element. It is a really significant body of work on justice for climate resilient development in cities. So with that, thank you so much. And I believe I now turn it over to Diana.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Diana Reckien, who is an associate professor at the University of Twente. She was the coordinating lead author of IPCC's 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 2. I believe it was the risk chapter that you led. And but here, Diana is she's one of the coordinating lead authors of the equity and justice element of the ARC 3.3. And yeah, so over to you, Diana. Let's see. Please tell us what the key messages are, and we'll take for the audience, if you have comments or remarks or questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat, and then we'll take them once Diana's presentation is done. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Minal, for the indeed great introduction, and also for Cynthia's great presentation into the ARC 3.3 series. And overall, thank you so much to Leila for inviting us to present our justice element here in the series. So I'm sharing my screen. And then put it into full screen mode. Should be there in a sec. Yes. Okay. So, I did this very profound work with my brilliant coordinating co-author Sirkku Johola from the University of Helsinki, and many great LA's lead authors here including Leila, who helped us out in the last part and really, really lifted it to the whole element to a different level, but also many others, Juan Camilo, Cristina, Maria Fernanda Lemos from South America, Hebala from Egypt, and Annika Nasra Haq now in the UK. So also here, really again stressing that we have global coverage to really have an insight in all the justice elements across the globe. Okay. So first, I want to give you an overview of what important terms there are in the element, but also in the justice literature overall, because that really determined how we structured the chapter. Here you see in the yellow boxes that we looked at 4 justice dimensions: distributive justice, recognitional justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice. And we looked at all responses, so impacts of climate change and both adaptation and mitigation responses to the impacts, to really cover different parts of the propeller, of the risk propeller: vulnerability, hazards, and the responses and exposure. And a very important aspect is also that we, as part of the justice element, included a focus on informality. So we really use data where possible to intersect how justice and informality come together, and in a very fruitful way. So not only highlighting informality where it occurs as a negative point, but also kind of to harness the positive aspects that come out of it. And overall, then we want to see what we can learn with regard to a just transition towards climate resilient development. Okay. To dig a bit deeper into the terminology and just to assure that we are all on the same page, distributive justice is about how climate impacts are distributed in cities, how are costs and benefits of adaptation and mitigation distributed. Recognitional justice is how disadvantaged and historically vulnerable groups are recognized as part of adaptation and mitigation decision making. And this very much is in line or intersects with procedural justice, asking, do all have equal access to climate planning and decision making? And restorative justice is an aspect that is just starting to emerge. And this is asking, can we, with climate planning, so with adaptation and mitigation, potentially make up for some historical injustices that have happened in the past? We see that mostly distributive and procedural justice are covered in the literature, different across continents and spaces, mostly those. So we see how impacts are differentiated across social strata, economic assets, geographic spaces, and how civil society is engaged in planning and implementation. Recognitional justice is a little bit underdeveloped, we would say, as well, looking at the importance that it has. Restorative justice, as I said, is just the new concept is emerging. There are other justice dimensions, like also intergenerational justice and things like that. They can be sorted in these 4 dimensions that we used. Okay. Then we already come to major findings, and this really looks at the research that we were able to synthesize, to assess, to evaluate, and new research that we were able to do with data that we have found and data that was previously, let's say, not brought together. So we really could generate new findings, which is actually also an innovative aspect of the ARC33 elements overall, that we really aim to also produce new knowledge, not only assess the state of the art. Here on the right-hand side, you see in two columns, so to say, how different metrics of impacts or hazards appear in cities, and on the right-hand side appear in all geographies. So with that, we see that justice outcomes in cities depend on the risk metric. And in the lines, you see, for instance, at the top, we picture or we show the number of disasters in cities versus all geographies. Then in the second line, we show monetary damage in cities versus all geographies. And then third, number of affected people, and at the bottom, number of deaths. So there are really profound differences, and most fatalities are due to riverine floods, heat waves, and landslides. Heat waves and landslides are a particular justice concern in cities, and those do not come up as prominent in other geographies. Most monetary damage is caused by flooding in cities. And most affected people, again, are due to cold waves and drought. So when you compare these in detail, we really see that cities and urban populations are differently affected. So we need a different approach to how we can increase justice aspects in cities to compare to all geographies. Then to another major finding. Currently, globally, cities located in low latitudes are more vulnerable to climate risks than those in high latitudes. Many of those have large urban informal and settlements. So in the maps here, you see the informal settlements around cities in gray. And you see that we do have a lot of informal settlements in Western Africa, but also in East Asia, and some might find that surprising, in Eastern Europe. Eastern and Southeastern Europe, in the Middle East. We have a lot of informal settlements there too, which goes back to that we have a lot of like wild, informal house building in the eastern parts of Europe as well. Then cities with high risks to heat, we see mostly in West and Southwest Africa, in the Horn of Africa, the Middle East and South America. And with floods, we mainly need to put the focus on West Africa, cities in northern India and Pakistan, cities in parts of South America and North Vietnam and Thailand. So already globally, highly unequally distributed. And then in the future, globally, we need to expect that climate change exacerbates urban inequalities nationally, internationally, and particularly for cities in the global south. And this is also due because more and more risks are assumed to influence each other, to co-occur, or to intersect in a way that they're compounding, occurring one after the other. For instance, frequent heavy downpours increasingly coincide with landslides, or warming and increased humidity increase deadly heat in Africa and Indian cities. In particular with the last example, warming and increased humidity, there is a lot of new research that came out that in particular the humidity increase makes a heat wave deadly. And yeah, with increasing temperatures, we also have higher humidity in many parts of the world. Okay. Then within cities, human vulnerability intersects with other vulnerability markers, for instance, hazardous locations and informal housing. Women, single parents, and lonely elderly and low-income housing face extremely heightened vulnerability to increasing extreme heat, heavy downpours, but also coastal flooding. Yeah, and we have examples in this table which you can look up in the element itself. Women are a group at particular risk, so we have even said most at risk, particularly those living in informal settlements, women of ethnic minorities, and women who live in poverty. Women frequently face other vulnerability markers. So also here we have the intersecting element with other vulnerability markers as the reason for this increased and heightened risk. And also another reason is that in a lot of places and regions across the globe, sociocultural norms further restrict the access to already limited resources. Okay, then we move on to major finding 5, which is regarding adaptation. So all the rest was more or less on impacts and risks. And now we assess the literature on adaptation. We see that both public and private adaptation are taking place in cities and they interact. That means unequal distribution of public adaptation may force individuals to adapt privately. And there is also a strong unequal distribution of public adaptation, which is so important. Yeah? In cities with, let's say, decent, with some funding from the government level, with good finances, but also with steady authorities, good public policy systems, there more adaptation is planned and also happening. But if that is lacking, then a lot of people need to do the best they can, which is often not that much, to invest in private adaptation and then secure their lives and livelihoods. The majority of cities, even if they plan for adaptation and try to focus on vulnerability, they are not centering their efforts on vulnerable populations. Unfortunately, the analysis of adaptation planning documents really highlights that cities rather focus on reducing the impacts on economic assets, so on vulnerable industries, on vulnerable businesses, but not so much on vulnerable populations. So there's really a lack here, and we need to raise awareness that that is absolutely needed. The right-hand side, you see examples of private adaptation from Anika, and here cities from Bangladesh. And then regarding mitigation, we also looked at what kind of equity and justice outcomes there are already in the literature due to the responses implemented in cities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We see that mitigation takes place through electrification of mobility systems, renewable energy production, and urban planning and greening. Many cities have carbon neutrality targets, particularly in the global north, with a strong focus also on European cities. But these cities often do not address justice concerns. And for many cities, there is a trade-off, or at least an assumed trade-off, that when they do one, that they cannot also do the other. Evidence suggests that urban greening tends to favor predominantly white and more affluent communities. So also there we have distributive justice implications. And here we have some examples from our authors, from our Chandni Singh and her colleague from here, urban agriculture in Bengal in India. So, and then we already come to the key messages. So we call key messages insights that are more policy relevant, policy in a policy language, which can be implemented by policies, really kind of, cater to the needs of policymakers. There is a growing interest to examine dimensions of justice, of low carbon transitions and decarbonization. So we see that in the transition literature and transition policies, there is a growing interest to incorporate justice. But we say that the burden of mitigation in particular should not be placed on the residents of informal settlements or the most vulnerable. It is an assumed perceived trade-off, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's not there in practice. And in particular, as they are not responsible for very low levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Opportunities for equitable development of adaptation and mitigation solutions need to expand to embrace informality by scaling up emerging technologies, pathways, and economic systems and across economic systems. So really try to think holistically and also to incorporate the positive aspects of decarbonization, like here solar panels, also to informal settlements. And another key message is then, how can this be accomplished? So we really also try to look deeper into the how, and again, deeper into the how. So really to go a little bit to the core and the root causes. And there we see that transformation of development is seen as needed to move away from unsustainable practices that result in high emissions and risk. And I see that in a lot of, let's say, practice environments and practice context, there is a sentiment of using the word transformation. We should not be afraid of the word or practical implementation of transformation. Let's see it positive, that we can do something better, that we can initiate a development with lower emissions and low risk. And transformational here means action that are significant in depth, scale, or speed, so that they affect many people, work across scales, or can be implemented fast, so that we can also learn faster. Scaling up transformations is critically important, but to date, little empirical evidence of justice implications of those transformations are actually recorded. And on the right-hand side, you see here a graph that we have used that shows that neither only adaptation nor only justice aspirations are important. We really need to see and think them together. And with that, I'm almost coming to the end. So there is another key message on the how. As I said, we really try to give as many practical examples of how this can be put into practice. And we summarize that: take the just urban transformation seriously, consider what justice implications transformations might have, so how the transformations affect the rights of those involved negatively or positively, so that all can equally benefit or be informed about potential or shielded from potential negative side effects. And here, the planning and the management cycle, which is plotted on the right-hand side, is often used in adaptation planning, but it comes from the management sciences, so it's also applicable to other forms of management and transition processes, with pointers to where justice considerations emerge during climate planning and action. So we have really pinpointed along these here 6 steps. Sometimes the management cycle is a bit shorter and you only have 5, or in a very short condensed version also 4. And we really show where it's important and what can be done at which stage in the process. So very hands-on practical insights and key recommendations for decision makers and policy decision takers and policy makers. And then I'm closing with our central figure that also guides you through the element itself. So I would conclude regarding the impacts that it's of utmost importance to include vulnerable groups in risk assessment and M&E, so monitoring and evaluation, focus on unintended consequences of past and current adaptation policies. Look at those, seek those, where are they? Only then, we can do something about it. Build technical capacities of disadvantaged communities in climate science impacts and response. And for adaptation, we would summarize that marginalized communities included in public planning processes need to be included there in fair and transparent ways. We should recognize and work towards minimizing historical injustices, institutionalize principles of equity and justice in adaptation, and prioritize funding, particularly for vulnerable populations. And with regard to mitigation, we have concluded that effective and participatory governance fosters well-being for all, that identifying the most significant emitters and marginalized communities is of utmost importance to really see where burdens can be placed, prioritize the rehabilitation of marginalized communities, promoting their well-being, and well-being is protected in equitable societies just as kind of a guardrail or a motivation that it's worth it. Then we also have, like Cynthia has already shown from the other elements, we have case study highlights here from the Barrio Intercultural in Argentina. We have a case study from the Greater Cairo area in Egypt, and we have a case study from Lusaka in Zambia. And you are more than welcome and invited to read about those in the element itself. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. You see here the cover page and then the QR code to the justice element, and also again the QR code to the case study docking station for all the case study insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diana, for such a comprehensive presentation and an even more comprehensive chapter, the element itself. And I encourage the audience to review it. It's a very well written, very clear document, and it's got actionable points. That's what I really like about the element, but also about the series, and for going into the 4 components, and also speaking from the IPCC special report, going into the how of the hows. And I think now we are at the stage in climate action where we know what needs to be done, but we're the how in terms of implementation, or the how in terms of scaling up is really what we're interested in, how it was done, how it can be done, and where the lessons can be taken from one context into a similar context. So thank you, Diana. And I believe we have a very nice engaged audience. We already have a question. I believe you can see the question, but for the live audience, I'm going to read the question. And this is directed at you, Diana, but I also invite Cynthia, Leila, and anyone who has contributed to the chapter to also chime in if you want to. So here's the question. Oh, from Alan Dill, there are two questions. Based on the research evidence available, what do you see as the most effective strategies for fostering meaningful public-private partnerships that also draw upon local or community knowledge? Over to you, Diana.
Wow. Public-private partnership, indeed. I would have had one more slide that would have spotlighted, highlighted that there is currently still a lack of information on how the public sector can actually work or is working towards climate transitions. That might be due to the fact that there is no documentation or enough documentation out there. So there might be actions, but we might not be able to have it in a written form, which is needed for these large assessments. But currently there is a lack of knowing what the private sector is actually doing and how it can benefit. So in that sense, when we are looking at public-private partnerships with the citizen engagement in particular, there is literature out there that is a very fruitful, potentially very fruitful and successful model. And with regard, yeah, but there is a little insight when it works or how or why. In particular, for mitigation, the challenge is that when you work with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the return is not only there for you, but for many others in the globe. So it's like, the feedback is not direct. So that makes it sometimes a little bit more difficult to work out these public-private partnerships. With adaptation, the feedback is very direct and local, but you can't really measure adaptation as easily as reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So there we need new frameworks, also agreed definitions, what counts as adaptation, what counts as general development, for instance, in order to make this more visible and more quantifiable. There is research in the development also, and particularly with the adaptation gap and with the Paris Agreement also calling out for more, let's say, clear assessments of adaptation. And that would be my first response. Maybe Cynthia and Minal, you have a nice example from New York. I know you really are very good in the public-private partnership in New York, right?
Yes, so I was just gathering my thoughts to provide an example from yesterday. Yesterday, I testified to the New York City at a hearing organized by the Committee on Environmental Resilience um, uh, of the New York City Council. So this is the city governing body. And at this, and it was the hearing, it gave an opportunity for the public advocate of New York City. We have a role that's an elected function to speak for the vulnerable groups. That person was there, the public advocate testified, the city agencies who have to be doing the nuts and bolts, especially there was a lot about the inland flooding, preparing. It's almost mind-boggling the challenges within any city to deal with inland flooding. But the government agencies, including environmental protection, housing, and planning were there. And then there was also the cultural aspect was included as well, because we're starting, one of the efforts that we're doing is starting a climate museum in New York City that includes both science, art, and community engagement. So my point about to answer the question, I think that really I think that there is movement, but what we need to encourage is the governments with their convening power, because it was around legislation to actually bring things forward. So I think it's a combination of hearing, listening, engaging, convening the groups in the same rooms, and then incorporating those views, sometimes contradictory, into the legislation going forward to actually do the transformative elements. In this case, they were talking about acquisitions from the most vulnerable places, buying out people's homes, how carefully you have to do that. Things really concrete. So that's my example just from yesterday.
Yeah, and I can also I can see other examples, like in particular when you do adaptation, which is local or regional, and when you then convince that the public authority pays for the adaptation, then kind of you could quantify how the impacts, the damage, the hazard goes down so that the public policy, the public arena has to pay less for recovery. And by that, we have the sufficient monetary incentive to bring the public on board. So there are ideas and examples, but so far the institutionalization and how it works still needs to be set out. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to respond, especially to your call for the monitoring and evaluation and analysis, because that is our new role. I believe, as researchers. You see, we've identified, well, right, we've brought the awareness of the vulnerability but now, in order to, this is a role for research and knowledge providers to do those monitoring, evaluation, and analysis of the solutions, right? Are they working? What's effective? We're working on this in the World Adaptation Science Program. We have a whole working group on adaptation effectiveness, because that's what's needed then to actually build the momentum to actually scale up, because when we know what works. And so that's what I think we as a research community need to actually tackle next.
Thank you, guys. No, I just wanted to quickly answer the question, but also turn to the second very interesting question in the chat. But I don't also have an implemented example, but I'll give you an example from Ahmedabad's Heat Action Plan, which is seen as a very successful model. It was participatory. There was a great plan. It was implemented. And since the plan was implemented, the number of deaths due to heat has gone down. But Ahmedabad has historically been a very hot city always, and summer temperatures go to 45 degrees, sometimes 46, and we know what the future holds. And so in the next iteration of and communities have these, what you call, Diana, private adaptations, but, local knowledge into how heat can be, how people can cope with heat. And that includes like locally made curtains and personal protection and a lot of just cooling interventions. And we are trying to get the local government to sort of build these into the plan and to sort of invite these communities or community representatives to feed into the next iteration of the plan. So yeah, there is hope, I think, and there are these excellent solutions which are out there, and we just need to formally bring them in. But I want to turn to this interesting comment come question. Thank you, Simon. I also jumped at it when I saw the panel, and it's a great opportunity to have a female organizer, Leila, and all three of us on this panel. All female panels are very rare. Usually I go to sometimes these mitigation talks where it's all gentlemen in suits, no offense, but so that the question Simon poses is about monetary valuation, and that we've tried to, because you need some kind of valuation to incentivize governments to change, but then these economic frameworks, economics-driven frameworks have their limitations, as Simon also notices. So, what is it that we can say about this approach? So, anyone
Yeah,
wants to take a cut?
if I may, I think the question very nicely summarizes two key points that were very important to me in this element. And this is that I want to show that their adaptation or risk is dependent on the metric that we use, and adaptation can respond to different metrics. So now here I have shown you can go with number of disasters or extreme events. You can go with fatalities. You can go with economic damage. You can go with affected people. You can go with people hospitalized. You can go with people in psychological care. You can agree as a society and as a city on different risk metrics. So, in that sense, monitoring, I hope for monitoring and evaluation, not to take the short route and only do everything in terms of economic value. It is important also with respect to the earlier question, PPP, but it's not the whole story. We cannot monetize everything. I mean, the health aspect is coming up so strongly, that after disasters, psychological impact is really there for a much longer term than rebuilding, sometimes for a lifetime. So we also need to take those into account. And when we take those into our assessments and into our evaluations, then we have a broader picture, and then we see that not acting is actually so much more dangerous, impactful than doing something now. Yeah. So it's exactly that question really connects something that was very central to me in the element. That's why we have the focus on different risk metrics. And also is, yeah, a very good point with regard to M&E, and that is just becoming a very, very active, dynamic point of research.
Can I jump in very quickly? We're coming to the end of our hour. Again, yeah, just want to delve a little deeper into that. I think so. I think the quantitative metrics are very important still. I think we have to do that. We need a lot more economists, or we have to learn how to do economic analysis more broadly, I think. But I think also for the research community, as Diana was just saying, that we need to be clearer about the qualitative metrics and the qualitative, or how do we bring those qualitative aspects forward in a coherent way, I think, because that part, you see, it seems like it's kind of almost fluffier, but it's not. It's so important. But I think, again, we as researchers need to really work together to bring forward, how do we make a portfolio of quantitative and qualitative metrics, really, or findings or evaluations. I don't think maybe we should we should have a different term for the qualitative. And I do believe that there's been a group of people working on this. Diana, you may be involved for to set the targets for the global goal on adaptation. And they're going to be presented at COP30, as I understand, at Belém. But I think what we need to do, those of us who really work on cities, let's create our own targets for and I think it's beyond adaptation. I think it's both
Yeah.
for really transformation in cities. That's
Definitely.
what I think we need to be
Yes.
doing. Really, let's do, as we go forward together.
Yeah, yes,
So
that's
next
sorry, go, Diana.
activity, Cynthia. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that in mitigation literature also we do discuss these concepts called the social cost of carbon and other approaches like the capabilities approach and the human development led approaches. But like you said, these are sort of seen as the alternate, and we're facing the challenge of sort of moving away from the more mainstream to sort of include these, or we don't have like a universally accepted alternate approach. So that's where researchers have to do a lot of work, I think. But on that note, I'm going to close as a thought for the audience to think about. And I'm going to thank my co-panelists, Cynthia and Diana, for excellent comments and presentations. I'm also going to thank Leila for putting the whole show together. She's hiding behind the camera. Please show your lovely face. Yes, thank you so much for putting this panel together, but also the team behind Leila who actually coordinated most of the stuff, including the social media. Thank you so much, everyone, and your comments and questions on email are also welcome. And see you at the next webinar.
Thank you so much to everyone,
Thank
also
you,
to the
of
nice
course.
questions and the organizers. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank
Bye.
you.